One of the benefits of doing what I do, which is 5 hours of talk radio a day, is I get a chance to meet some fascinating people, at least by telephone. And one of them is our guest this morning, Mr. Ashley Mote, who for many years was an international businessman, and more recently he's a member of the European Parliament. Now that is not the English Parliament. That is the European Parliament. He's an independent member for Southeast England, and he has to go over and sit there and listen to all these speeches. And as Mr. Mote has told me, I mean, they have this Parliament, but the Parliament really doesn't accomplish anything. Everything is done by the bureaucracy, a massive bureaucracy, which will be the commissars who will rule Europe, because the whole idea of the European Union is to be a supranational government that will control Europe, just as we are moving in the same direction here in North America, South America, Asia, Africa. For there indeed is a diabolical plan to unite the world. Now, Mr. Mote has several DVDs. One is called Vigilance. The other is called Overcrowded Britain. There is a booth here in the next room for Mr. Mote, and you can stop by and pick up the material and a great deal of other material. But Mr. Mote is totally dedicated to trying to expose what's going on today. Because if the people of Great Britain and the people of Europe and the people of the United States did not take a stand, there is a very small group, very, very small, very powerful, very wealthy, who has a different vision of the world. Their vision of the world is a one-world government under their control, a new world religion with the destruction of all the values that have once made Western civilization the envy of other nations throughout the world, and certainly the imposition, I believe, of a coming world leader. So without further ado, because you didn't come to hear me talk, Mr. Ashley Mote, thank you so much.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'm the one with a funny accent. Or maybe you're the ones with a funny accent.
Point to the microphone. There you go.
Now, this is a conference about conspiracy. But I'm going to talk about something which, whilst undoubtedly a conspiracy, is so big and so blatant that there is really no need for it to hide and no need for us to call it a conspiracy, because it involves 27 nation states, independent, sovereign nation states, and it involves nearly 600 million people. And they find themselves being ruled today by an unelected elite which has put itself above accountability and which is primarily concerned not with the well-being of 600 million people, but with perpetuating power for themselves. And in a sense, I could now sit down and say, that is all you need to know about the European Union. But what I'm going to talk about is merely filling in some of the detail. Now, before I get into the detail, how many people here have visited mainland Europe? Most of you. And how many of you have been to the European Parliament in Brussels? Ah, well, in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And here I am, a man from the old world, talking to you in the new world, and in a sense, to borrow a phrase from my good friend Vladimir Bukovsky, I have seen your future. What I'm going to talk about is very much what is coming and is already underway on this side of the pond. In the old days, when the sun never set on the British Empire, some 2,000 people around the world governed it, and on the whole, it was a huge success. Today, the European Union, which covers the 27 states I mentioned entirely on the western fringe of Europe, is governed by, wait for it, 100,000 bureaucrats. And their purpose is control. You might think that legitimate government is or should be about enabling the people to thrive. That is not what happens from Brussels. We had a debate, so-called, in the Parliament not so long ago, and I was allowed 1 minute, because that's the way debates are organised, managed. And it was a debate on enterprise. And I listened to a succession of left-wing softies talking about more management, more controls, more regulation, more telling people what to do. And this was an enterprise debate, would you believe? And finally it came to my turn and I couldn't resist. And I screwed up the notes for my alleged 1 minute. And I said to them, I wonder how many people sitting in this chamber today have ever had the idea for a new business, have generated the money at their own risk to launch it, have employed people, marketed their products, generated wealth, paid staff regularly at the end of every month, and created real wealth and new jobs for a community that didn't enjoy them before. How many of you have done that and done it for 20 years? There are no prizes for guessing how many hands went up. The truth is that the European Union is essentially about standardization. It's about making everybody the same. They talk about diversity, but that is a myth. It is part of the illusion. We have, for example, at the moment, a big row going on about metrication. The European Union wants to create standardized metric measurements for all products and services, all items which are exported anywhere in the world. And I have constituents quite rightly coming to me and saying, we do not want this regulation because it will damage our business with our largest customer, which is the United States of America, where they don't use metric measurements, they don't want them, they don't need them, and we have to service our customers according to their needs and not some bureaucrat sitting in Brussels telling us what's what. And they're right. And I think there is just a chance we may finally win that battle. But it is an example of standardization for its own sake, because standardization makes control easier. We have seen in recent years amongst our own civil servants, paid for by British taxpayers, our departments of government being in effect taken over by the Brussels machine. We had, for example, one of the finest civil aviation systems in the world. The British Civil Aviation Authority was held up as a primary example of how to manage civil aviation. We have the busiest international airport in the world on our shores, and the performance of that organization was exemplary. But it has now been hollowed out. Now it does what the European Safety Aviation Agency, based in Cologne, tells it to do. It no longer has the right to issue airworthy certificates. They are issued in Cologne by a German-dominated institution of the European Union. And on one particular occasion, when, again, for a client, a constituent, I was in the offices of this organization in Cologne, and we were met by the chief executive, and he boasted to me, that he had never, ever been to Britain. And yet here he was managing an organization which had taken control of air traffic control in the UK. It was monstrous. Now I want to come to the 100,000 people who run the European Union. There are some 3,000 or so secret committees who advise the European Commission, which is where all the power is and where all the decisions are taken, and those commissioners are nominated, one each by each member state, so they're not elected and they're not directly accountable to the populace. And these secret committees deal with every minute detail of planned legislation. Whatever the topic, you can guarantee there is a secret committee meeting to decide what the law shall be. The fact that I sit on an elected parliament is neither here nor there. I am part of the charade. I am part of the supposedly democratically accountable section of the European Union's system of government, but essentially we are there to provide a kind of democratic fig leaf. We have no powers of repeal. We have no powers to generate new legislation. We have no direct control over the budget. All we can do at best is to slow down and possibly try to amend what the Commission and its secret committees have already decided to do. And these committees are made up of other bureaucrats. They're made up of invited so-called experts. We don't know who they are. We do know that there is not a single elected member of the European Parliament sitting on any of them. We don't know what their agendas are. We don't know what their budgets are. We don't know what decisions they've reached. And, above all, we can't get rid of them. Now, the money. We're talking about 1,000 billion euros a year. Forgive me if I don't attempt to convert that into dollars. Just take it, it's a lot of money. The accounts of the European Union have never, repeat, never been signed off as a true and fair record of their financial affairs. Not once. And I and a number of other energetic, difficult, probing MEPs who don't really care about our personal careers because we're there to do a different job, we have been digging very hard over the last few years, and we've come up with some very interesting answers, even if they've taken months to get them. We now know, for example, that the European Union has 662 bank accounts in 45 countries, undoubtedly including this one. We also know that of those, there are 30,000 pre-financing accounts. Now, the accountants in this room, if there are any, will know immediately the significance of what I've just said. Because what it means is there are 30,000 individual accounts financed from public money by the European Union, and which then become under the signatory of the recipients. And at the last count, only 1% of those pre-financing accounts had ever been audited. And after 5 years, if there have been no proper records of that particular account, whichever it might be, then that sum of money is written off. So what happens is this. a project is agreed, maybe it's to do with farming or infrastructure or whatever. The money is allocated, a pre-financing account is opened, the people who are going to manage that project become the signatories, the money is deposited in that account for them, and if they want to be difficult after 5 years, effectively they can walk away with the lot. Several of us have raised the question of cost-benefit analysis, which is a pretty simple, well-known, established principle. And in the end, we were given the answer that they couldn't possibly, on any account, undertake a cost-benefit analysis on any particular project that was under consideration, because the standards of scrutiny and accounting in each of the member states must be different, and therefore there can be no common base on which to make a cost-benefit analysis. So let's not bother at all. And let's look at some of the examples briefly of the corruption that follows from this nightmare financial mismanagement. We have Greek farmers applying for subsidies on olive groves which are clearly 6 feet under the sea. The land mass included in their applications for farming subsidies is greater than the land mass of Greece itself. Well, I know it's funny in a sense, but I'm a taxpayer. This is coming out of my pocket, and millions like me. Then we come to Italian butter. Oh, the Italians had a wonderful wheeze. They discovered that if they processed their own butter in their own country and then shipped it to another member state, they'd get a special premium. But not satisfied with using the butter that they already had, a large firm decided to dilute it with animal fats of various kinds. It's even been suggested they used engine oil, but never mind. And this went on for years. Everybody knew it was happening, but it was impossible to get any government or any institution of the European Union to get a grip of the problem and deal with it. I have a case that I'm working on at the moment. It involves the Humanitarian Aid Commissioner for the European Union, a man called Louis Michel, who's a Belgian. And we know that he is paying money to what was the Belgian Congo for humanitarian aid purposes. We also know that his son is married to the daughter of the chief executive of one of the largest Belgian arms exporters. We also know that that same company has an interest in a company in the Congo which is mining raw uranium and shipping it to Iran. Now, you don't need me to spell out the links. And we've put it to them, and we get silence. I don't have the power at the moment, none of us have the power to make our knowledge make a difference, because we are part of the charade. I've described the Parliament's role just now, and we sit there every lunchtime when the Parliament is meeting in full session, and we have to vote on what the Commission has already decided. And on the whole, these votes are in favour because there is a built-in majority of support. Because the European Union is much cleverer than the Soviet Union. They used to slaughter their opponents. The European Union buys them off. And we are very well-paid monkeys pressing buttons for bananas. Every lunchtime we sit there and we may have 300 votes to do. They all take maybe 45 minutes at most on electronic button pushing. And provided we press the buttons, we get paid. And if we're not there and we don't press the buttons, we don't get paid. Let me just talk a little bit about the structure. There is a council of ministers at the very top who are supposed to be representing the nation-state members. Now, this council meets every few months, briefly. It's supposed to discuss strategy, but nothing else, and off they go back to their respective countries. The Commission, as I mentioned just now, is where the power lies. They are the nominated representatives, one from each member state, and they run the whole show. And I have to tell you that of the 27 current incumbents, 10 of them are former communists. And I believe that some of them still are. At the very best that can be said, the majority are socialists. And that brings me back to Vladimir Bukovsky. Now, I don't think he's ever spoken at one of your conferences, which is, in a sense, is surprising because he'd be right up your street. Vladimir, in the 1970s, was regarded as such a dangerous threat to the Soviet Union, where he was born, that he was finally swapped for a Soviet spy who'd been caught in the West. And today, he's quite an old man. He speaks good English now, and he lives quietly in central England. But he still speaks his mind. And many of you may have heard him on Stan's talk show, because I think he's interviewed him at least once and maybe more. Now, Vladimir has described in considerable detail the parallels between the Soviet Union and the European Union and their secret agreements to work together. And Vladimir even has the documents to prove that statement, and he's invented his own acronym to describe it. He talks about the EU SSR. Now, the origins of these agreements go back to just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the Social Democrats, that's the socialists to you and me in Western Europe, and the Bolsheviks in the USSR agreed to work together to form a communist conspiracy, if you like, from Ireland in the west to Vladivostok in the east. And that plan is now well advanced. Only last year, for example, the Italian government proposed that Russia should be invited to join the EU. And they, of course, had their eye on the oil and gas. Fortunately, the Russians said no, not now at least, but you can be sure that when they do finally say yes, as they almost certainly will, they will have their eye on seizing power, because their oil and gas will give them control over the European Union. And therein lies the risk to the USA. So the circle will have been closed. And the EU's efforts to create a political entity large enough to blunt what is known as the American hegemony will be greatly enhanced. They can forget, they think. They can forget the US so-called hegemony over Europe since World War II has given that continent the greatest peace and prosperity it has ever known. They will try to forget that Europe cannot even deal with local crises like the wars of the Yugoslav succession without American help. And they will try to forget that the minute bullets start to fly in Europe or elsewhere, European unity vanishes. Earlier this month, some of you may have seen in your newspapers or in the media, the new French president said that he was, wait for it, ready for France to stand by the USA on the world stage. I mean, if it wasn't so absurd, it would be truly comic. Have you ever been slapped around the face by a wet fish? Sikorsky's motivation for that extraordinary remark was pure ego. It was nothing to do with the real world at all. Europe cannot match American military power, for example. We cannot match your defence budget, to say nothing of the 40-year head start you have on technology. Our defence forces today are a joke compared with your Star Wars resources, and all Europe put together couldn't launch a single state-of-the-art stealth aircraft. So often the European Union is simultaneously grandiose and absurd, like an overweening comic actor, unaware that he's in the middle of a dreadful tragedy. But more seriously, ladies and gentlemen, the EU is evil, and, in my judgment, it is beyond redemption. As Bukowski put it himself, the EU is like a disease. It can't be cured, it can't be eradicated. He was once asked, possibly on a radio show of Stan's, about reforming the EU from within, a favourite mantra, I might add, of many successive British governments, every one of which has failed to do anything of the sort. And Vladimir likened the idea to the experience of his Russian friends when they were young. He said, "It would be like going to a brothel to cure VD. You end up catching it." And whether you like his colourful language or not, he had a point, because the EU is a latter-day Soviet Union. The Council of Ministers that I described earlier is a ruling clique. The Commission is the equivalent of the Politburo, and the powerless European Parliament in which I sit is the so-called Supreme Soviet. Even our plenary session chamber looks like the old Supreme Soviet. And like the former USSR, the governing institutions of the European Union, the Council of Ministers, the Commission and the European Central Bank, are all unaccountable to the people and appear at times utterly contemptuous of them. The EU shares many other obvious characteristics with the USSR. Its power base elects itself and cannot be dismissed by the people. It seeks to establish laws which bind its successors and cannot be repealed, something which is an anathema to the Anglo-Saxon world. And it gives itself legal supremacy over member states. It creates law by bureaucratic directive, as I described earlier. And it's invented a Supreme Court which has an obligation, would you believe, to interpret the law in its favour. And it often does so with a breathtaking arrogance and disregard for the consequences on ordinary people. And above all, this is a system with no mechanism to stop it. There is no way of changing this method of government. It is a one-way ratchet, and it could be the most spectacular slow-motion coup d'etat in history. The governing elite have given themselves immunity from prosecution for life. They pay themselves huge, virtually tax-free incomes. Vast sums of public money disappear, as I described earlier, and corruption is not only endemic, it is totally out of control. And all this, of course, is quite deliberate. It allows a continuous looting of taxpayers' funds by those at the top without accountability. And there are many other EU parallels with the former USSR as well. They introduced a new currency, as did the Soviets. They introduced a new flag and anthem, as did the Soviets. They introduced a new means of creating law, as did the Soviets. And, most terrifying of all, they systematically use psychiatric so-called medicine to eliminate troublemakers, as did the Soviets. The only big difference is their attitude towards the open market economy. After 70 years of evidence that the USSR's command economy was a disaster, and more evidence from Western Europe over much the same period that heavy-handed socialism is also a disaster, a new strategy was required. And the Russians had also finally realized that guns and bullets don't work either. So they decided to use the open market economy to fund their political aspirations. Free markets would be allowed to generate new wealth and an endless stream of taxation to pay for this new form of totalitarian government. It was a stroke of Machiavellian genius because it turned the enemy's strength into a source of strength with which to destruct it. No wonder that Mikhail Gorbachev was less than heartbroken when his regime collapsed. As he later commented, he saw a bigger and better version spreading from the West. Now, law-abiding people like the British are obedient. And it must be said, we stupidly observe the 170,000 pages of legislation that Brussels has so far invented. The rest of the EU picks and chooses what suits them. It's their way of coping with bureaucratic stupidity. If you don't like the law, you ignore it. And they ridicule us Brits behind our backs because they see us enforcing everything. Yet another example, if you like, of the UK being a square peg in a European round hole. We are used, as you are, to elect a new parliament every few years, which has an absolute right to repeal every piece of legislation that any previous administration has passed. Now that encourages lawful behaviour. It encourages respect for the rule of law, but not so in continental Europe. Changing the law in many continental European countries is a very difficult and lengthy bureaucratic process. It is much easier to ignore what you don't like. And if everybody else does so as well, where's the problem? Which brings us to the proposed EU constitution, which was rejected in referenda by both the French and the Dutch year before last. But surprise, surprise, however sophisticated the European Union bureaucracy is, it doesn't understand the meaning of the word no. Right now, despite these two no votes in two sovereign countries, there is a frantic effort going on in the capitals of Europe to resurrect the dead constitution. And a presentation I made when we first fought the first round of this argument has now to be resurrected as well. And I'd just like you to see the beginning sequence of that tape. If our colleagues will run it for me, please. Thank you. That is a 315-page tome described rather grandly on the front as a constitution for Europe. And that proposed constitution brings into the sharpest possible relief a very simple question that we Brits should have asked ourselves at least 30 years ago. Who governs Britain? After inventing parliamentary democracy 800 years ago, do we now want to throw it all away? Do we want to govern ourselves, or are we willing to hand over governance of these islands to a foreign power? That is the question. And here's another one. When ever before has a sovereign nation permitted outsiders to write and impose a new constitution on their country except after defeat in war. We are, and always have been, a British square peg in a European round hole. The UK uniquely is being asked to change almost every important aspect of our culture, our traditions, our way of doing things. In this country, the state draws its power from and answers to the people, us. In the European Union, the state exists in its own right and the people answer to it. Here, our rights and freedoms are our birthright. In the European Union, they are granted and removed by the state. Here, no man is above the law. In the European Union, the bureaucrats have granted themselves immunity. Here, we can regularly throw our government out, and in the European Union, the rascals aren't even elected in the first place. In Britain, everything is permitted until our elected parliament decides otherwise. In the European Union, everything is implicitly forbidden unless the state decides to allow it. Here, our market economy is based on free enterprise and risk-taking. In the European Union, the market is governed by social considerations. Here, we have the common law safeguards of habeas corpus, trial by jury, and the presumption of innocence. The European Union uses a Napoleonic system of criminal law that provides no such safeguards against the oppression of the state. Here, we uphold and respect the rule of law because we can change it at any time, and we know that that is the case. In the European Union, there is much less respect for the law because it is almost impossible to change. Here, the police exist to uphold the law and the armed forces to defend the realm. In the European Union, they exist as arms of the state. And here, we do not tolerate fraud and corruption in public office or anywhere else for that matter. But in the European Union, it is endemic and accepted as part of the system. When I first read this tome, I struggled to find a phrase that adequately summed it up. And then, remarkably, Tony Blair found it for me. He is looking for, or was looking for, weapons of mass destruction. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a weapon of mass destruction. And it is a real one. And it's here. It's not in Iraq. It's right here. It is a weapon of mass destruction of democracy and the nation states, because it turns what is currently a Europe of nations into a nation called Europe. Now, speaking of this beloved new constitution, its author, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, said, and I quote, "Our continent has seen successive efforts at unification. We now seek to unify it by the pen and succeed where the sword has failed." Think about that. And Romano Prodi told the European Parliament last December, "We are not merging states. We are uniting human beings." The arrogance, the unmitigated gall, the nerve of it. This, ladies and gentlemen, in my opinion, this document is the most dangerous threat to this country since 1940. And the European Union meeting that inspired the idea of this constitution actually charged the group set up under D'Estaing to find ways of making the European Union, and again I quote, more democratic, more transparent, and more efficient. Now they promptly turned themselves into a presidium. And where have we heard that word before? And when you read the preamble to the final draft, we find that the words democratic, transparent, and efficient have all completely disappeared. And instead, it now reads, how to bring citizens closer to the European design, whatever that means, how to organize politics in the enlarged union, and how to develop the union as a model for the new world order. That is what this is supposedly all about. Now, D'Estaing told the European Parliament that this proposed constitution was a revolution in law. That was his phrase. But revolutions are uprisings of the people against the ruling elite. Such events don't normally create law, they normally precede it. So this revolution is unique, because this is a revolution by the ruling elite against the people. And its full title is Constitution for Europe, apparently claiming authority over nations of the entire continent, whether they're members or not. And I can tell you that the Norwegians and the Swiss are very cross about it, and with good reason. And when you compare this lengthy document with the great elegance, simplicity, clarity, and sheer wisdom of Magna Carta, the Declaration of Rights, or the American Constitution for that matter, there is no comparison to be made. This Constitution is deeply flawed. Essentially, it is not a constitution at all. It is little more than an elaborate attempt to legitimize the seizure of power by a ruling elite. And if it succeeds, Westminster will become redundant and its powers stripped bare. There are, in my opinion, at least 6 fundamental defects, any one of which must make it utterly unacceptable to the British. It is vague, grandiose, imprecise, deliberately complex, confusing, and extremely long. But more important than any of that, it is proscriptive rather than enabling. It makes law instead of creating a framework for lawmaking. It offers no effective checks and balances to control future lawmakers. Instead, it consolidates power for a system of government by a self-perpetuating bureaucracy. And it puts that elite group above the law to be imposed on everyone else. Essentially, it completely reverses the present legal relationship between the European Union and the member states. It turns them from being the theoretical masters of the House of Brussels into its servants. At present, the treaties draw power from the member states, and under this constitution, the European Union creates power for itself. And it specifically demands unquestioning obedience and support from the member states.